The Aphids came in June of 1987. That was when everything started. The fields of Dewey County, Oklahoma had seen dry springs before, but the spring of 1987 came in dusty and stayed that way, and by the third week of June, the wheat aphids had moved through Gene Pruitt's neighboring section and were sitting thick on the underside of every leaf in Gene Mosley's own. Gene stood at the edge of his soybean field that Tuesday morning and rubbed the leaf of one plant between his thumb and finger. The sticky residue came off on his skin. He wiped it on his jeans. He was 47 years old and had been farming this same 320 acres just west of Sealing, Oklahoma since 1968. The plant was covered. Every low leaf on that row, every low leaf on the next, pale green aphids, maybe 2 millimeters long, packed 4 and 5 deep on the undersides where the morning light didn't reach. Not a dozen plants, not a single row. The infestation ran the length of the field, south to north, following the irrigation ditch line where moisture had gathered through May. Gene had seen aphid pressure before, not like this. He walked back to the truck. The Chevy C10 he'd had since 1979 was sitting with the driver's door open, morning temperature already at 83 degrees at 7 in the morning. He got in. Sat, the radio played something he didn't listen to. Then he got back out. Walked the row again, all the way to the south fence. Came back. The count didn't change by looking twice. The standard call was straightforward. Every farmer in Dewey County knew it. Call your ag co-op, order malathion or dimethoate, spray when you hit threshold. Threshold for soybeans was roughly 250 aphids per plant on 80% of plants. Gene had counted 3 plants at random that morning. The numbers he'd gotten were 340, 410, and somewhere above 500 on the third, which he'd stopped counting. He was above threshold. He estimated he'd been above threshold for at least 4 days based on the spread pattern. He drove to Fairview that afternoon. Talked to Dale Ingram at the Dewey County Farm Bureau office on West Broadway. Dale was 12 years younger than Gene and had come up through the Oklahoma State Extension Program in 1981. He looked at Gene's field notes and wrote down 2 products without looking up from the clipboard. Told Gene to spray within 48 hours. Told him he was already behind. Gene looked at the page. Malathion at $22 per gallon, requiring roughly 3 gallons per 40 acres, meaning 24 gallons for the full field. Plus application. Plus the cost of tractor time and the second pass if populations rebounded, which Dale said happened in about half of heavy pressure years. Gene did the arithmetic on the drive home. 2 applications, 320 acres, close to $1,100. Maybe more if he needed a third. He had the money. That wasn't the question. He drove past Roy Hendrick's place on Route 47. Roy had sprayed 3 days ago. Gene could see the tractor tracks in the field from the road, parallel lines running east to west where the boom had passed. The soybeans looked clean from the road. They also looked slightly yellow at the top canopy, which happened after a heavy spray cycle, sometimes from the chemical stress itself. Roy's field would tell the full story in 2 weeks. It usually did. Gene got home at 5. Carol had dinner going. He ate without saying much. After dinner, he went to the barn. He had a copy of a USTA publication from 1984 that someone had left on the counter at the co-op, a literature review on integrated pest management for row crops in the Central Plains. He'd skimmed it twice when he first picked it up, enough to remember it existed. He found it under a stack of seed catalogs on the workbench, smoothed the cover, and sat down on the overturned 5-gallon bucket he used as a stool. He read the whole thing that night. The Lacewings section was 4 pages. Chrysoperla carnea, green Lacewing. common throughout the central United States, present in agricultural fields wherever aphid colonies occurred. A single Lacewing larva consumed between 200 and 400 aphids during its larval stage, which ran 10 to 14 days from egg hatch. Adults, once established, laid eggs near aphid colonies on their own without further intervention. The natural cycle, if populations were established before chemical disruption, could reduce aphid colonies by 60 to 90% within 3 weeks. The publication listed 3 suppliers for commercially reared lacewing eggs. All 3 were in California. Overnight shipping kept cold in insulated boxes with gel packs. Price per 1,000 eggs ranged from $4 to $7, depending on quantity. Jean read the section twice more, set the publication down on the workbench, went back to the house. It was 10 o'clock. He called the number the following morning. The supplier was a company called Rincon Vitova Insectaries out of Ventura, California. A woman named Beverly answered. She knew her product the way Jean knew his soil, which was fully and without hesitation. He explained his situation: 320 acres, soybeans, heavy aphid infestation, Dewey County, Oklahoma, dry spring, no spray yet in 1987. She asked about spray history for the past 30 days. He said none. She said that was good. She said lacewing releases worked best on fields with no recent pesticide history because you weren't introducing predators into a zone where the residual chemical killed them within days of hatching. She told him to figure his acreage and pressure, then order at roughly 5,000 eggs per acre for a heavy infestation. Jean said he couldn't treat the whole 320, not yet. He didn't know enough. She understood that. She said start with your worst zone, maybe 4 to 5 acres, watch it for 2 weeks, then decide. She'd done this consultation 100 times, 5,000 eggs per acre, 4 acres. 20,000 eggs. At $5 per 1,000 on his quantity, that was $100 for the eggs. He told Beverly he wanted to start smaller. He asked what the minimum order looked like. She said they sold packets down to 2,500 eggs for $12 including brand carrier, but not including shipping. Overnight to Oklahoma would be $22. Jean said he'd start with the $12 packet. See what it told him. Beverly said that was fine. She took his address and his credit card number, said the package would ship the following morning and arrive Thursday. She gave him her direct line in case he had release questions. Before she hung up, she said one thing more. She said whatever he saw in the first week, don't spray. Let the larvae establish before drawing any conclusions. Jean said he understood. The package arrived Thursday morning at 7:40, according to the clock on the kitchen wall. It was a box roughly the size of a shoebox, triple-taped, with a fragile sticker on 2 sides. Jean opened it at the kitchen table. The insulation was dense styrofoam. The cold pack was still cold. The lacewing eggs came in a sealed bag mixed with brain, which served as a carrier to spread them evenly during release. The eggs themselves were too small to see individually. The bag looked like gray dust with a faint shimmer if you held it at an angle to the window light. He read the release sheet Beverly had tucked in with the order. Release at dusk or dawn, not during midday heat. Aphid colonies concentrated on the undersides of leaves. Walk rows and distribute bran mixture by hand along the row middle and at the base of infested plants. 1 pass per day for 3 consecutive days if possible. Keep the release area free of chemical spray for a minimum of 30 days. Store unused eggs below 50 degrees. The whole bag was for 1 pass over his 4-acre test section. Jean ate lunch, drove to the field at 6:15 that evening. The light was low and even, the heat starting to break. The temperature had dropped to 76 degrees. He took the bag and walked the south corner block, 20 rows he'd already marked in his head as his worst pressure zone. The release technique was simple. He opened the top of the bag loosely and walked the row at a slow pace, tilting the bag forward in small pulses to scatter the bran mixture every few feet along the row middle. At infested plants, he held the bag lower and distributed a heavier concentration at the base, near where the worst aphid clusters had been building. The bran landed in the soil and on the lower leaf surfaces. Some of it caught on the leaf hairs and held. He covered the section in 50 minutes. Put the empty bag in the truck bed. Drove home. Nobody drove past the field while he worked. Nobody saw him doing it. He told Carol at dinner what he'd done. She asked how much it cost. He said $34 total, including shipping. She said that was less than 2 tanks of gas for the C-10. Jean said yes. She didn't ask anything more about it. He returned the following 2 evenings and repeated the pass. Beverly had said 3 consecutive releases improved establishment by giving the eggs different hatch windows in case a temperature dip or morning rain event killed early larvae before they could feed. The second and third passes were from a second bag Jean had asked Beverly to include. She'd thrown in a small backup packet at no charge. He used both evenings, 30 minutes each, same technique, same section. 3 releases, 6 days. Total field time, roughly 2.5 hours. No tractor, no boom, no mixing, no cleanup of equipment. He'd done it in street clothes with a paper bag. The next morning, he checked 3 marked plants in the release area. The aphid counts were the same as before. That was expected. The eggs hadn't hatched yet. He noted the numbers in a spiral-bound notebook. 340, 380, 420. Same 3 plants he'd been counting since the infestation began. He checked Saturday. The numbers were still up. He drove to town Sunday for church and fuel and saw Dale Ingram coming out of the hardware store. Dale asked if he'd made his spray decision. Jean said he was holding a couple more days. Dale looked at him the way he looked at farmers who were about to make expensive mistakes. Said he was risking real yield loss for every day he waited at that pressure level. Jean said he understood that. Dale said the co-op had malathion in stock and could fit him in for Tuesday application. Jean said he'd call if it came to that. He drove home. Checked the field Monday evening. Same. He was now 8 days past the initial heavy infestation count. By any standard extension recommendation, he should have sprayed 10 days ago. Thursday morning, 8 days after the release, 12 days after first heavy count, Jean found the first Lacewing larvae. He was on his hands and knees in the 4th row from the east fence, turning leaves over the way he'd been doing every morning. The larva was pale yellow-green, a centimeter long, moving slowly among a cluster of aphids near the base of a leaflet. It had the curved mandibles the publication had described. It looked, Jean thought, like a tiny bent twig that could move. He found 3 more larvae in the next 10 minutes. One was actively feeding, an aphid clamped in its jaws. The others were moving through the colony. He counted aphids on his 3 marked plants. The numbers were 295, 330, 360, down from the previous readings, not dramatically, but down for the first time since the infestation had started. He noted it in the notebook with the date and time, Thursday, July 2nd, 1987, 7:20 a.m. Roy Hendrick stopped by the following Friday evening. He said he'd heard around town that Jean hadn't sprayed yet. Jean confirmed that. Roy said his second application had cost him another $360. His aphid population had rebounded 11 days after the first spray. Roy was looking at a possible third application, depending on what the canopy did in the next week. He looked out over Jean's field from the truck window. Said it didn't look bad from the road. Jean said it wasn't good up close, but he was watching something. Roy didn't ask what. He drove off toward Route 47. Gene checked his marked plants the following Wednesday. The counts had dropped to 190, 215, 240. He walked 15 additional rows in the release area and pulled random leaf checks on 20 plants. The median count across those 20 plants was roughly 185 per plant. He'd started above 400. The population had dropped by more than half. He stood in the row middle and looked down the line of plants. The canopy was full and dark green, no yellowing, no stunting, no visible stress damage. Just soybeans growing in July the way soybeans were supposed to. He ordered the expansion order that Saturday. 50,000 eggs to cover 14 additional acres. Cost $250 for eggs, $30 for shipping. Total $280. He was now at $314 for the season, including his first $12 test order and the $22 in shipping from that initial package. Beverly at Rincon Vitova remembered his name when he called. She asked how the test release had gone. He told her the numbers. She was not surprised, but said the suppression rate was strong for his timing and weather conditions. She said the dry spring had actually helped because wet conditions could cause fungal issues in Lacewing larvae. She processed his order in 4 minutes. The package arrived the following Tuesday. Gene spent 2 evenings releasing the expansion order, walking the field at dusk both nights, covering the 14 additional acres in sections. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. He didn't announce his results at the feed store. He kept it in the notebook. His full field aphid count at the end of July showed a consistent range of 115 to 175 aphids per plant across the field. Economic threshold was 250. He was below it. Had been below it for 2.5 weeks. The adult lacewings were now visible in the early morning, translucent wings, maybe 15 millimeters long, resting on the upper leaves in the cool of the morning before the heat of the day drove them into the canopy. They moved between plants. They laid eggs near aphid colonies. The cycle had established itself without further input from Gene. He walked the whole field the second week of August. End to end, all 8 north-south rows of his 320 acres, checking leaves at random. He counted aphids on 30 plants spread evenly across the field. The range was 90 to 210, median around 145. Every single plant below threshold. No chemical had touched this field. He stood at the north fence and looked back down the length of the field. The canopy was closed. Dark green, no yellowing, no stress flagging in the upper leaves. Soybeans in August, doing what soybeans did when they weren't being interrupted. Harvest came in mid-October. Gene pulled 42 bushels per acre. He compared his number to the county average from the Oklahoma Agricultural Statistics Service Fall Report, which he picked up at the Farm Bureau office in November. The county average was 38 bushels per acre. Roy Hendrick, who Gene talked to at the co-op in December, had come in at 37. Roy had spent $720 on aphid management. Gene had spent $314. The yield difference wasn't entirely due to pest management. Gene's seed variety, his soil prep from the fall before, his irrigation timing, all of it mattered. He didn't claim the lacewings had done everything. But he could state the following plainly. The aphid pressure, which had been severe in 1987 across most of Dewey County, had not cost him yield. He had come in above the county average. He had spent less than 1/3 of what the chemical program would have cost. He wrote it up in the notebook. 1 page, 2 columns. His numbers and his neighbor's numbers, side by side. Then he labeled the page 1987, put the notebook on the kitchen shelf above the toaster, and started planning his 1988 release calendar. Dale Ingram called in March of 1988, said the county extension office was building a demonstration series on integrated pest management. Said someone had mentioned Gene had run an IPM trial on his field. Asked if Gene would participate in a field day that summer. Gene said he'd think about it. He called back 2 days later and said yes. The demonstration ran in late July on 10 acres of Gene's East Field. Dale brought in a graduate student from Oklahoma State named Tom Wester, who had field experience with biological controls and could speak to the mechanisms, why lacewings worked, what disrupted them, what made a release succeed or fail. 42 farmers from Dewey, Major, and Woodward counties came out on a Tuesday morning in July heat that topped 97 degrees by 10 o'clock. They stood in the row middles, and Gene walked them through the notebook page by page. Every count, every shipment, every receipt. The original $12 test order, the $280 expansion, the final total of $314, the 42 bushels at harvest against the 38 bushel county average. Tom Wester filled in the science between Gene's field numbers. One farmer from Major County asked how you knew the lacewings were working, and not just natural aphid population cycling. Gene said that was a fair question. He said he couldn't prove it absolutely. He could only say that Roy Hendrick's field, which had sprayed twice, had come in at 37 bushels. His field, which had not sprayed, came in at 42. That was one data point. The OSU research Tom Wester had presented was a larger data set. Taken together, it was enough for him to try it again in 1988. The farmer from Major County nodded, wrote something in his notebook. Most of the 42 farmers said nothing directly to Gene about whether they intended to try it. That was how it worked. You listened. You drove home. You decided privately. Gene had done the same thing with the USTA publication 3 years earlier. 7 of them ordered lacewings the following spring. He knew this because Beverly at Rincon Vitova told him in her October call. She'd had an uptick in Oklahoma inquiries starting in August 1988. She didn't name names. Gene didn't ask. The OSU Extension Bulletin came out in 1989. Dale Ingram was listed as the primary author. The bulletin cited Gene's 1987 field data in the case study section under soybean aphid management. The language was academic. The numbers were Gene's numbers, verified against his notebook during a farm visit Dale had made the previous fall. Dale Ingram never mentioned, in the bulletin or in conversation, that he had told Gene in June of 1987 that he was already behind and risking yield loss. Gene never brought it up. There was nothing to bring up. Roy Hendrick made his first lacewing order in the spring of 1989. He called Gene in April. Asked 3 questions: when to release, whether you needed a sprayer or special equipment, and how long before you saw results. Gene answered all 3. He told Roy to start with a test block like he had. Told him to call Beverly at Rincon Vitova and tell her his acreage and pressure history. Told him to keep his spray program out of the release area for 30 days minimum, which meant accepting some early anxiety while the larvae established. Roy thanked him. Didn't say anything about 1987. Didn't need to. Gene Mosley farmed the same 320 acres west of Siling until 2006. 19 years of lacewing releases. He adjusted his release calendar, his application rates, and his timing window each year based on what the previous year's notebook had shown him. By 1993, he had a full-season integrated calendar that covered first emergence in late May through canopy closure in early July, with release timing adjusted for planting date and predicted spring moisture. His average release schedule ran 3 orders per season, a small early-season scout order when first aphids appeared, a main establishment order at threshold approach, and a smaller booster order if pressure was severe. He kept records on 19 years of aphid management. 17 of those years, 0 chemical applications for aphids. 2 years required targeted spot sprays on specific field corners. 1992, when a heat event in late June killed significant larval populations before colony suppression, and 1998, when late planting pushed his schedule back and compressed the release window. Both years he used a single spot application on less than 40 acres, not the full 320. And both years he resumed Lacewing releases the following season without hesitation. His 19-year average annual cost for aphid management, $68. That included the 2 spot spray years. County farmers he compared notes with at the Winter Farm Bureau meetings reported annual aphid management costs between $400 and $1,000, depending on pressure and whether they'd needed multiple applications. Some years the gap between Gene's number and theirs was $800. On 19 years, that was a significant amount of money that had stayed in his operation. He never made a study of it, never presented it, never wrote it up beyond the notebook entries. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He was farming. The Extension Bulletin from 1989 got picked up by the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service and reprinted in a regional digest that went to farm operations in 9 states. Gene learned about this when a farmer from Meade County, Kansas, called him in 1991 looking for the Rincon-Vitova phone number. They talked for 20 minutes. The Kansas farmer had corn aphids, not soybean aphids, but the release protocols and timing principles were similar. Gene gave him Beverly's direct line and told him to describe his pressure history from the previous year and ask about release rates for his corn acreage. The Kansas farmer called back 2 weeks later to say he'd placed his order. Gene wished him luck and hung up. Over the next 5 years, Gene received 14 calls from farmers he'd never met. Some had found the Extension Bulletin. Some had heard about him through a farmer who'd attended the 1988 field day. One man from Garfield County said he'd read a mention in a farm magazine and tracked down Gene's number through the Dewey County Extension office. Gene answered every call. He told them what he knew. He gave them Beverly's number. He told them to start small and keep their spray out of the release area. He didn't think of it as teaching. He thought of it as answering the phone. Gene sold the farm in 2006. He was 66. His daughter and her husband had been considering it for 2 years before he made the decision. The couple who bought the property from him were second-generation farm family returning to production from Tulsa. During the closing walkthrough, they asked about his rotation schedule, his irrigation setup, and his chemical program. Gene told them he didn't have much of a chemical program for aphids. He showed them the notebook. They looked at 19 years of entries. The aphid counts, the release dates, the shipment receipts, the yield comparisons. The woman asked if she could keep the notebook with the property. Gene said yes. Told her to call Rincon-Vitova each March and describe her pressure history from the previous year. Told her to start her first season with a small test block and not to spray until the larvae had 10 days to establish. Told her that the first week would feel wrong, but to hold. She called him the following June. Said the aphid counts were high and she was getting pressure from her neighbor to spray. Gene asked what the count was. She said around 300 per plant on the worst block. He asked whether she'd released yet. She said 9 days ago. He said give it 5 more days and count again. She said what if the counts go up? He said count again in 5 days. She called back 6 days later. Said the counts were at 180 and dropping. Gene said there it is. He still gets a call from that farm every spring. May. Usually. Release timing question. Usually. He picks up and walks them through it. Always tells them the same thing. Start small. Keep your spray out. Let the larvae work. The notebook is still on a shelf in the farmhouse kitchen, 8 miles west of Sealing on County Road 530. 19 years of entries, the first one, dated June 9th, 1987, written in Gene Mosley's handwriting on a Tuesday morning when the Aphids were heavy and every other farmer in 4 counties was ordering malathion. Gene Mosley reached for a different phone number. It cost him $12 the first time. He never lost a crop.